Hi, I'm Pastor Dennis Platt. I'm the principal of Vision Colleges, the very best Bible college on or off the internet. But you don't need to take my word for it. Go to our new website, internetbiblecollege.com. There you're going to find all that you need for Bible college or for biblical studies, whether you want to do a subject or a certificate, a diploma, whether you're looking for professional development. You'll find that Vision Colleges is the most flexible, the most affordable and the most relevant Bible college you will find anywhere. But right now, I'd like to continue with our series on the world's greatest story, a series on church history by Ken Chant. And you know, I can almost see your eyes rolling in despair. Church history! Who needs it? Church history is probably some of the most fascinating history that you'll come across anywhere, because church history is full of the most powerful experiences, the most exciting experiences that you can read anywhere on any subject. There's no other issue in history that brings together the power of God, the capacity of men and women to work with God, and their ability to change the world, and the trials that they went through. They left us with a heritage. And you and I fail ourselves, and we fail those who went before us by failing to understand our history. But even worse than that, we still run the risk of repeating it if we don't learn to learn it. So here we are, church history, the 2nd century. That is what we're going to be looking at. Some of the events that happened in the 2nd century that saw the incredible growth of the church. And it really is an incredible growth. And it verifies the very words of Jesus when he said, "I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." I will build my church and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Of course, that was an astonishing statement to make just over 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was talking to just a small band of 12 men and women who were his followers and determined to see what he was at that stage. But to this unlikely group of men and women, Jesus makes that statement. It's powerful, and it's something that's lived on down through history, and it's proven to be correct. History is one of those strange things, though, that people wrestle with, and it impacts us in different ways and in different times. There's an interesting story that the French Emperor Napoleon III, having completed a history of the life of Julius Caesar, he wanted to give a copy of it to his son. He decided to check that with a German writer who's called Mommsen for an opinion. Well, Mommsen said, "How old is the boy?" 14, said Napoleon. "Good, give it to him now," said the boy. "One more year and he'll be too old for it." Well, unfortunately, that's so very many times true. We very quickly forget to learn history. Euripides, the Greek dramatist, insisted, "Whoso neglects learning in his youth loses the past and is dead for the future." Youth is the best time to learn pretty much anything, especially history. But you know something? I'd rather learn history late than not learn history at all. And I'd rather learn history late than to miss out on the very lessons that it has for us down through the centuries and into today. So history is important. What did the early church go through to make things happen? Well, there were so many different things. The first 500 years saw the missionary outreach, it saw persecutions and government, it saw the development of the local church and the charismata and doctrines being developed, so very many things occurred during that time. The 1st century had been an interesting time. Of course, it was the time when Jesus and the disciples were very much involved with the church. It was a time when the church was growing, the baptism of the Holy Spirit had exploded, and so many wonderful things had happened. But by the end of the 1st century, things were starting to change considerably. You know, our best information on those first 1,000 years comes from the Bible itself, from the book of Acts and from the 4 Gospels. The rest of the epistles also shine some light onto the early church, but beyond that, there's not much really that's available. When we get into the 2nd century, we start to find a few more things are going to evolve. We're back to the 1st century. Problems arose for the church after the death of many of the apostles, and the early church was struggling to try and find out how it should work. And so a book was written which was called the Didache. It was written about 1200 AD, and it was lost in antiquities until 1873, when it was found in a monastery in Constantinople. The Didache simply means the teaching. The full name is The Teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles by the 12 Apostles. And it covers many things concerning Christian life, practical instruction, Christian virtue, water baptism, the Eucharist, how to treat itinerant prophets and so on. But as I say, it's been lost for centuries. You can get a copy of it, and if you'd like to, you can always contact us at the college, where we can make a copy of the Didache available to you. It comes along with a copy of various other books that just speak to us from that very early time. Towards the end of the century, after the Apostle John died, many people left the church. Many were disappointed because Christ had not returned as he'd promised, or at least the way they saw things, he hadn't returned the way he'd promised he would. And that was probably the first serious challenge that the church faced, as many people did leave. But nonetheless, it wasn't very long before the numbers of the church were restored, and with it entered the 2nd century, and it had a good foundation for strong growth. The problem is, after John had died, strong leaders arose, and they wanted, I guess really like today, they wanted to impose on the growing numbers of the congregation some kind of orderly cohesion. The appearances of false doctrine from time to time obliged the churches to draw together for self-protection and to find a cohesive form of belief. Doctrines began to be prepared and presented. Leadership by the apostles and prophets began to be replaced more and more by the administrative rule of bishops and other ecclesiastics, and well, we began to see the formation of what we would call today a denomination, although it was still quite a bit removed from what we see today, not being bound by government regulations and so forth. At the same time, varieties of small sects sprang up, rather reminiscent today, each one of those protesting that the main churches had already begun to depart from the faith, and each one of them claiming to preach a purer doctrine. And how many times have we heard that today? Such an old message, still being passed on down through the centuries. During this time, the practice of worship became more standardized. Liturgies were developed, doctrine formalized, rules of life for Christians were begun to be imposed in the church, and the first attempts were made to determine which of the apostolic writings should be joined with the Hebrew Scriptures and form for us what we would call the New Christian Bible. The second also saw the first outbreaks of serious persecution of the church by the Roman authorities. That's the 2nd century, by the way, saw this begin to happen. And of course, history well records much of that. Nonetheless, in that 2nd century, the violence, though terrible for those on the receiving end, was spasmodic, and it was mostly restricted to particular localities. But despite this, the number of Christians continued to increase steadily. The missionary outreach of the church was beginning to move, and by the end of the 1st century, witness of the church, while still a minority of the population, probably about 10%, had become influential enough to command attention to all levels of society. Sadly, today, the influence of the church, though a much greater percentage of the population, is far less influential than it was back in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It was still a largely silent century. Some writings of the fathers are still available, A few references to Christianity can be found amongst secular documents of the time. But on the whole, there is very little detailed knowledge of the history of the church of this period. We can only piece things together as best as we are able. Early in the 2nd century, one of the things that had happened was the church was disentangled from its Jewish roots. Up until this time, the Christianity was seen as a sect of Judaism. Well, for better or for worse, that was to be separated. The disadvantage of removing Christians from Judaism was that it lost the legal advantages under which Judaism operated. It could no longer operate as freely and as easily as Judaism did. It had lost that covering. But at the same time, it gained the advantage of removing from the church the restraints of being identified with a particular race and culture, and it gave to the church a newfound freedom of expression, which it was able to take advantage of. You see, back in those early days, the church chose to embrace from the church service, from the religious aspect, it chose elements of Judaism, such as the Hebrew scriptures. They copied the pattern of worship used in Jewish synagogues. They gave preaching the major place of their services and the like. So in a very real sense, very many things that we see in our churches today are very, very similar to what was happening in the synagogue of the time of the 1st century and the 2nd century. They were also free, though, to embrace elements of the Hellenistic culture around them, especially within the governmental structure of the organized church. The terminology they used to describe their offices and the manner of formulating and expressing their growing body of doctrine. All of these were now to be influenced strongly by the Hellenistic culture, which proved to be very, very helpful and very powerful indeed, given that the Greek culture, although under the rule, if you like, of the Roman culture, was still very much a predominant culture of the time. It gave way to a great deal of open blessing for the church in its early growth. The church remained predominantly urban in character, spreading out across the empire from city to city among the common trade routes, only gradually being tasked with evangelizing in the surrounding countryside. The movement of the church came largely because of local persecution, and it came about as people were able to move more freely at this time, and this was because of something called the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana meant the peace of Rome, and that had created a peace around the empire that had not existed for centuries. It made it possible for a great deal of movement by people around the world, of the known world at the time. Before that happened, it wasn't possible. And after the end of the Pax Romana, it was almost impossible for that freedom of movement to occur. In fact, it wasn't really mirrored until Pax Britannia during the 18th, 19th centuries, where the freedom of the British Empire brought peace to the empire and freedom of movement among the empire. And indeed, during Pax Britannica, we saw more missionary movement than at any other time. It's very interesting because so many times people will say to us, well, we need persecution. The church needs persecution. No, it doesn't need persecution. What the church needs is peace. As Paul wrote to Timothy, pray for peace and prosperity so that the church might be able to grow and develop. And that's what was happening. So what we see then is that the whole world was now ripe for the promotion of the gospel. As Paul had said in Galatians 4:4, that the time was ripe for Christ to come. By the time Octavian Caesar made himself the first emperor of the Rome, the scene was set for the proclamation of the gospel. The time was right for the church in a number of ways. The time was right for the church spiritually. After 1,000 years of reverence, the old paganism was dying everywhere. The ancient myths, by now mocked by playwrights, poets and philosophers, had lost their power of persuasion. An alternative had been provided by the Jews who built synagogues everywhere. But nonetheless, The austere monotheism was appealing, but the exclusivity of Judaism, tainted by its ethnic trappings, was too harsh in its physical and in its cultural demands on the people to accept it. So there still remained this worldwide hunger for a better understanding of God. It had grown in society much the way that in society today the same thing is happening. People are hungering for God. There's an incredible parallel in the 21st century to the 2nd century, as we'll see as we go through this. That hunger for knowing God was linked with an expectation of the time. The Roman historian Suetonicus, in his Life of Vespasian, wrote, "The ancient supposition was current in the East, that out of Judea would come rulers of the world. And indeed, out of Judea had come the ruler of the world, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and it was to be his time. And in spiritual sense, that time was being birthed." The same time, or the same as at the same time as the spiritual need for God, for Jesus, was being released in the community, there was a cultural release as well. Alexander the Great had spread the Greek language, its civilization and literature throughout the world. The Romans acknowledged the superiority of the Greek language and their culture and encouraged its dissemination, so that by the time of the apostles, Greek culture was everywhere. It was either spoken or at the very least understood. And here's something else. The genius of the Greeks, that lay in their art and their literature. For the Jews, they were uniquely gifted in religious insight. The skill of the Romans was expressed in government and law. So what happens was that all of these three come together at the same time, and by the time of the apostles, by the time the principles of the Romans had become firmly established in the empire, and provided an example that the ideas of the gospel, the forensic ideas of the gospel, with its message of justification by faith, it was comprehensible everywhere. Everybody understood this concept. So spiritually and politically, the world was coming together, ready for the proclamation of the gospel. 100 years earlier, and no one would have grasped what Paul was writing to the Galatians. 100 years later, and they would have been buried and seen as something ridiculous and incomprehensible. The legal basis upon which the gospel stands was so deeply rooted in Christian theology and in the culture of the churches, it could not be destroyed no matter what happened politically for the rest of the world. The time was ripe for the release of the gospel, not only spiritually and politically, but also in a very practical way. The century before Paul began his mission, Julius Caesar purged the Mediterranean Sea of pirates, thus making transport across the sea relatively safe. The biggest worry, of course, was still the ordinary perils of the sea itself. But sea travel had become safe and well understood. The Roman fleet provided the pathways of the ocean, and so it allowed Christians to travel across the known world of the time, taking with them the message of Christ. Now, whilst the seas had been tamed, the Roman army had taken the empire with paved roads threaded throughout the whole world. The Roman roads, still many of those Roman roads are available today. Those Roman roads were safe, they were guarded by chains of military forts, and so now, for the first time in history, the very first time in history, it was safe for travel across the world by foot, by horse, by boat. The nations were brought together under a similar structure politically, under a similar structure practically, under a similar structure, and they were waiting spiritually for the gospel to be proclaimed. People were waiting. They didn't necessarily know what was coming, but they knew something was being birthed. The time was right for the gospel. Socially, changes were happening. The Emperor Augustus and the 300 years of comparative peace, unparalleled in the ancient world, began. The nature of the gospel, as said earlier, cannot be successfully promulgated in times of war, in disorder. Wars and riots destroy the proclamation of the good news of peace. And we only need to look at the last century with World War I, World War II, how the churches and the message of the gospel was so terribly shattered during these times. So Paul writes to Timothy and says in 1 Timothy 2:2 that we need to pray for peace and prosperity so that the gospel can be promoted. And indeed, into this time of peace and prosperity, the gospel was being promoted. Around the world, the gospel could be heard. The process was assisted, by the way, by the laissez-faire structure of the Roman society. Anyone in Rome was free to pursue any career he or she chose and to live wherever they pleased. And so that encouraged this growth of movement of people around the world. Now later, it is true that the empire, as it began to crumble, decided to start changing the laws, and they tried to lock people into places and into professions and prevent them from moving around in an attempt to try and control people. But before that happened, the church took great advantage of their capacity to take the gospel around the world. And by this time, the laws that were helpless to hinder the continued growth of Christianity. The saints of the early days knew well how to take advantage of the circumstances in which they found themselves. They saw what was happening or simply moved with what was happening, but they were effective. Perhaps the most rapid spread of the gospel was assisted by this universal spiritual hunger, or universal spiritual hunger that was existing. The yearning for spiritual reality was caused by several factors, one of which was the fact that masses of people had suffered a loss of personal identity and sense of worth. And this was because the Romans, as they moved into areas, they would move into areas, in some cases they would enforce Roman ideas, laws, culture onto the people, and in so doing the people would lose their identity. They would lose a sense of who they were. They would lose the sense of culture, and so they find themselves like ships in the sea, unable to understand who they were and what they were, unable to hang on to the past. The other problem, of course, was that other places and other times the Romans would move into an area, capture it, and take the people captive, so they're moved away from their home into a new area. So reminiscent of the world today, with so many refugees around the world flooding the nations, people moving around. When we move, we can't take our culture with us. When we move, we can't take our past with us. We can take memories, but we can't take the culture with us that we need to take. And so there's a tremendous sense of loss. Men and women who once held a place of significance in small communities were reduced to a state of unimportance in a population in excess of 200 million. Imagine what it must have been like for many of those people. They are largely devastated. No other empire homogenized its citizens the way the Romans did, culturally and in Rome. Ordinary people suddenly find little or no meaning in their lives when they were helpless to modify, let alone control the shape of the world. So people began looking for a solution in a higher dimension. The former social and religious ties were severed. People might pray, but they had no confidence that their gods would be able to hear them, because gods of the day were restricted to their areas. And gods were very even though they were a human invention, the concept of gods in those days were local. So if you're taken from one area to another, you have to come under the local god. You can't bring your god with you. What do you do? How do you cope with such a dreadful influence on you? So this hunger is growing and it's nurturing. The old religions, worn out, had lost vitality. Whatever power they once possessed has gone, and the questions were being asked. Who is the supreme deity? Is it Zeus, the god of the Greeks? Jove of the Romans? Yahweh of the Jews? Osiris of the Egyptians? Is there a real creator? The world was ready for a demonstrated proof that there is one loving, all-powerful, all-caring God over every person. And so into this void, into this ache, Christianity is birthed, enforced and empowered and delivered by the power of the Holy Spirit. Even the culture of the day was suffering such deprivation that historians wrote longingly of the past and looking with contempt upon the present. So that scene paved the way very much for a new religion. The demands and opportunities of the empire had created a social mobility more than had ever existed before. Now people could only look to themselves and to their immediate families. Everything seemed short. Questions were being asked. The possibility of immortality. What does death mean? Can one actually survive the grave? And if so, what then? And into that scene comes the gospel. Into that scene came those anointed, empowered of the Holy Spirit. For back in those days, every Christian everywhere was baptized with the Holy Spirit, spoke in tongues, and was able to speak with the power and authority of the Holy Spirit, affirming the gospel. And so into the world at that time came the gospel of Jesus Christ, and no wonder it began to grow and develop. It was fascinating. There was one other thing that was happening that's just worth noting, and that was the growth of various cults at the same time. Some of them tried to overtake the church. The cult of Zarathustra already numbered many millions, and it seemed for a little while that that cult would overtake Christianity. But you know, the void that that cult left meant that it wasn't to be. And the church continued to grow. And so by the year 2000, it had reached the furthest bounds of the empire, and it had got into many lands outside of Roman control. Christians were still a minority, but very big one. Old paganisms was still the religion of the majority, but their grip was weakening. By now, the new faiths were compelled to give way before the dominance of the church, proving once again those prophetic words of Jesus as he was to say to Peter and the disciples, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Well, I hope this thumbnail sketch is going to help you a little bit to understand something of the things the early church entered into, but I want you to get hold of the book, The World's Greatest Story. Where can you get it from? You get it from Vision Colleges, the internet biblecollege.com. You can find it there. And as I say to you so many times, why do we keep bringing these messages to you? Very, very simple reasons indeed. As I say so many times, because you matter, and matter so much that God sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And the amazing fact is that for 2,000 years and more, the church has been marching forwards until today, from a band of 12, or maybe 120, one might say, to today, over 1 billion people, 2 billion people almost, around the world worship Jesus. Truly, he will build his church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. You've been doing a study on the world's greatest story on the 2nd century by Dr. Ken Chant. Available through Vision College's internetbiblecollege.com.